I am really delighted to welcome onto the show Cassandra Winzar, who is Chief Economist for CEDA, which is the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. And we're really blessed to have the Chief Economist living right here in Western Australia. Good evening, Cassandra. Welcome to Money News, live and local here on Radio 6PR. Delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks, Karalee. Always lovely to be on the show and have a chat with you.
Yeah, look, definitely. Now, look, I've got you on this evening because I wanted to have a chat to you about the Federal Treasury's Employment White Paper, which we know builds on the Jobs and Skills Summit held late last year. It's expected to be released at the end of the month, and it should provide a guide, as to how the Albanese government plans to address the upcoming structural changes, increasing labour productivity and improving employment opportunities for all Australians. Now, as I mentioned, you are Chief Economist for CEDA, and you've been quoted as saying the labour force figures showed that despite the rapid rise of interest rates this year, the labour market is proving remarkably resilient, with the unemployment rate remaining at 3.7%. Now, given that you are based here in Western Australia, what does this actually all mean for Western Australian industries? What are they saying to you?
So, Karalee, we've got a few short-term challenges, but also some long-term challenges in the West Australian labour market. Economists like me are eagerly awaiting the Federal Treasury's Employment White Paper because that's going to show what their plans are for the path forward for labour markets. So how do we make sure that we have the right skills, the right amount of people to meet some of the challenges that we have right now, and are also coming our way in the future with things like the transition to cleaner energy sources and the demand for more care workers as we see demographic changes. At the moment, the overall unemployment rate in Australia is sitting at around 3.7%, and it's a little bit lower here in WA. It's around 3.6%. This is incredibly low from a historical perspective, so it's much lower than we'd normally expect. And it's also much lower than we'd expect when we have interest rate rises like we've seen over the past year. So usually when interest rates increase, what we see as a bit of the trade-off for that is that unemployment falls. But we haven't seen much of that, and that's why we're saying it's been quite resilient. And what that's showing is just the broad range of labour shortages that we're seeing throughout all sorts of industries, and that's really strong here in WA. So we have over 55,000 vacant jobs in WA. And if we go back, if we compare that with 3 and a bit years ago, just prior to pandemic, we only had 27,000 vacancies. So we've doubled the amount of vacant jobs in WA in just over 3 years. And if you talk to any industries, particularly industries such as construction or mining, but also care industries, the number one thing people will tell you is that they're struggling to find workers. That's a really big challenge for businesses, but also a challenge for governments in order to make sure we've got the policy settings right, to train local workers and to get in the right level of migration.
Cassandra, as you said, 55,000 vacancies. It is a lot compared to pre the pandemic. Now, CEDA, Committee for Economic Development of Australia, it's been very strong in its suggested reforms that would lead to a more dynamic and mobile labour market and improved productivity outcomes. Can you outline some of those reforms for our Money News listeners? And I also know, and you also just said, that CEDA has said that the care economy remains one of the sectors facing the most challenges in attracting and retaining staff, both now and into the future. Job vacancies in that industry are the highest of all industries and have been growing over the past year.
So we really need to look at making sure we're training up our West Australian workforce in the right skills that they're going to need for the future, and also looking at what our migration settings are and making sure that we're getting the right qualified migrants in to fill the roles where we don't have enough capacity domestically. So one thing that we particularly think on the training side is around making it much easier for people to change careers. And there's a much bigger role, I think, here for the TAFE sector than we've really utilised historically. So it's often really hard if you're kind of midway through your career. You see that maybe there's better opportunities elsewhere. You see, and that might be, in a different industry or a different role, but you need to go back and do some training. Most people aren't able to take 3 or 4 years out of their career to go do a university degree, but they might be able to take a few months out to do a TAFE course. So we really need to make sure we've got some really good, accessible and relatively cheap courses that can help people change industries or upskill in order to meet the demand for changing workforces. This is particularly important in the care workforce. And by care workforce, I'm talking about things like aged care, disability or healthcare. And particularly if we have an ageing population, we're seeing more and more demand for these services and more demand for workers. So we really need to make sure it's easy for people to get into these industries, that they can get the right training and build their skills. But on top of that, we also need to look at what the role of migration is. We probably will need to increase migration for some of these industries, and also look at the pay and working conditions. So aged care workers did get a 15% pay rise this year, but they're still one of the lowest paid workforces out there when we compare them to other industries. So there might be a role for some further pay rises there as well.
That's great. We're talking with Cassandra Winzar, who is Chief Economist for CEDA, Committee for Economic Development of Australia. A couple more questions before I let you go this evening. And also, I'm also interested in our listeners. Give me a ring, 133 882, or send me a text, 0487 999 882. Have any of you decided to swap careers midway through your professional life? Have any of you decided to actually do what Cassandra has said and enrol in a TAFE course to perhaps go into one of those care industries? Perhaps you've got aged parents and you've been inspired by the care your parents have given. Your kids are off their hands. You're not quite ready for retirement, but you want to reskill. I'd love to hear from you this evening. Now, Cassandra, if it's possible, I'd like your take on the expected fall in Chinese demand for our WA commodities like iron ore. The WA Chamber of Commerce and Industry says it's essentially really going to whack our state's economic growth this financial year. We know that China's economy has struggled to bounce back after lifting its COVID zero policy late last year. And while it is gearing up, we have seen strong iron ore prices, more than $120 per tonne. It is slower than we thought. There may well be problems ahead. We've seen and covered in recent weeks on the show that consumer confidence is down in China. Youth unemployment is at record highs. Foreign investment is right down. China's property sector is what I call roller coastery. And, given that Pilbara iron ore is used to produce steel along with other metals, and I think the CCIWA is expecting economic growth to slow to 1.75% this financial year, 2023, down from 3.5% last year, 2022. What does Western Australia need to be wary of?
WA is a very export-focused economy, and the vast majority of those exports go to China. So we're very reliant on Chinese demand, not just for our iron ore, but also for a lot of our other exports, whether that's education, tourism, or even agriculture. So we're much more reliant on what's happening in China than other states. And you're right, it hasn't bounced back from COVID in the way that many of us have expected, and we are seeing slower economic growth. That can flow through pretty directly to demand for products from WA, and iron ore is the biggest one of those. So this will weigh on the WA economy, particularly in the short term. We'll have that slowing Chinese demand, but we're also seeing slower economic growth throughout Australia, as well as the impacts of interest rate rises, which are going to further slow economic growth. So the expectation that economic growth will be slower this year than last year is very likely to be correct.
Cassandra,
in the short term, this is not much of an issue. It's part of the kind of normal business cycle. But what we really need to do is prepare for the longer term and look at having a more diverse economy that's not as exposed to one market, which is China.
Cassandra, it is, and that's been said many times over many years. Let's hope that stuff like that now does actually happen. Now, look, before I let you go, it is the elephant in the room, but we know that the federal government's proposed industrial relations reforms are very contentious between various interest groups. We've heard from both unions and industry and government on this show previously. There's also a chance of changes to federal environmental laws, and these two things add to uncertainty about future growth. Here in WA, as you know, mining operations, they're centred on and built around the flexibility that labour hire provides. And as I said, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry WA has come out describing it as Australia is effectively shooting itself in the foot at the moment, as it's going to impact and hamper our ability to capitalise on opportunities. From the Committee of Economic Development for Australia's point of view, what are your thoughts on this?
So there are clearly some concerns from the business community about some of the proposed changes, whether that's around IR or environmental regulation. The most important thing I think here is that the government needs to listen to what these concerns are, and they'll need to address them in some way. That may be through further explaining what's going to happen with the changes and reassuring businesses, or it may be making some changes to them. But businesses really need to know that their concerns are being heard, and government needs to listen. Businesses are looking for certainty over the operating and regulatory environment that they're in order to make investments. And so the more that we see uncertainty, and especially if the government doesn't address that and doesn't listen to businesses, we may see them holding back on investment, which will further slow economic growth.
Cassandra Winzar, Chief Economist for the Committee of Economic Development of Australia, known commonly as CEDA. Thank you so much for your time tonight on Money News Radio 6PR, part of the 9 Radio Network.
Thanks, Karalee.